Doctor Who Season by Season. New Who Series 1 Review. Yes, it's the moment you've all been waiting for. The first New Who Season Review. If you've seen any of my other Who-related videos, you've probably noticed a number of comments indicating that I don't exactly have the highest respect for the 21st century version of Doctor Who that began in 2005. Personally, I don't even really regard it as a continuation of the original series, however much the fanboys, particularly those running it, clearly desperately want it to be. I view it more as a sort of parallel universe spin-off version, or televised fan fiction if you will. That doesn't necessarily make it bad, just so you know, but it quite clearly actually isn't really the same show in any sense that actually matters. But still, on with the show. What was my reaction to fan fiction Who Series 1 at the time, and what do I think to it now? It might surprise you to find out therefore that at the time I pretty much loved Series 1, and was extremely positive and excited by the new series. Even today I still regard this season as one of the better ones, so I feel I may disappoint those of you wanting to see me stick the knife in with unparalleled gleeful malevolence. I should wait until some of the later seasons for that, if I were you. Anyway, Series 1 kicks off with Rose. I loved this episode at the time, though it hasn't really aged well. Two things I enjoyed then and still like now are, happily, the regulars. Christopher Eccleston, who I've liked ever since his turn as the doomed DCI Bilborough on the classic British crime drama series Cracker, instantly makes an impression as the new Doctor, and Billie Piper is also very strong and likeable as the down-to-earth Rose, and there are some very good scenes with them both. The problems with the episode lie with the script and the direction. The story is basically just a thin rip-off of the third Doctor debut story Spearhead from Space, only nowhere near as good. The direction also seems rather juvenile and comic book, and it's a bit shameful that a scene lifted wholesale from Spearhead, the infamous window dummies coming to life bit, is much more poorly done and infinitely less scary in 2005 than it was in 1970. These concerns deepen with the end of the world. This episode was the first one where doubts about the new series began to creep in with me. Eccleston and Piper are again the highlights, and indeed the pair of them are pretty much the episode's saving grace. Otherwise it's again a very thin plot that goes nowhere very interesting and is wrapped up in record time. This is by no means an awful episode, and by God there's been a whole heap of shit worse than this since, but it was the first time I began to doubt the new show and is still my least favorite of this season. Things pick up with The Unquiet Dead. Still the best New Who story from Mark Gatiss, and rather bizarrely the best Christmas episode they've ever done, which is rather strange since they've been doing Christmas specials for a decade now and this wasn't even one of them. This is the first time the new show tries for a bit of old-school horror, and it works pretty well, with good performances and a very nice Christmas ghost story atmosphere. I think it's pretty underrated to be honest, and of course Simon Callow steals the show as Charles Dickens. Next up is The Aliens of London two-parter, the first multi-part story of the new series and thus the first cliffhanger of the 21st century. Aliens of London is not a terribly popular story, but just to be contrary as usual I've actually always rather liked it. At the time it seemed like a very fun and very different kind of story with its worldwide crisis stuff, though of course the Davis era overdid this shtick to the point of absolute crushing tedium. Still, that's not really this story's fault and I find it a bit of a laugh all told. Dalek is next and this is about 3/4 of a very good episode. It's massively overrated in fan circles, of course, and is nothing particularly special, but certainly for the first 35 to 40 minutes it's a good old-fashioned slice of Eric Saward-esque kill-em-all action fun. It falls apart at the end, however, and this was another of those moments where I, briefly at the time, began to wonder a bit about New Who. The Dalek topping itself at the end is incredibly badly done, and over-sentimentalized to the point of complete and utter absurdity. I think it's the bit where the Dalek tendril reaches out to feel the sun that gets me the most. I never know whether to burst out laughing or reach for the vomit bag post haste. It is one of the worst moments of the season, and while this sort of thing stands out a mile here, it is a glaring example of the kind of nauseating excess sentimentality and inappropriate emotional incontinence that would come to typify the new series, particularly in the Davis era. Next up is The Long Game, which I can't find much to say about really. It's pretty damn average, neither terrible nor particularly good. Simon Pegg is fun as the villain, and the atmosphere, particularly the ice level, kind of reminds me of Dragonfire, which just has the effect of making me wish I was watching that instead. Father's Day is next. I quite liked this at the time, but these days it's one that I just can't sit through. Cryathons are just not the kind of thing I watch Doctor Who for, and while this is handled better than later editions in the new series, it hasn't aged well. Rose's daddy issues were done to death the following season, and the time travel stuff, particularly the Reapers, no longer makes much sense following the endless fucking about with time in the Moffat era. It's well acted but really not my cup of tea. The Empty Child two-parter is next and is easily the best story since The Unquiet Dead, and a bona fide genuine 100% classic. I love this story to bits, and it's still the best 21st century televised fan fiction New Who story, which is a bit damning to say 11 years later, to tell you the truth. Still, it's a cracker, and it gave Stephen Moffat his reputation, albeit not the reputation he's earned himself now after his largely awful tenure as showrunner. Boomtown is the penultimate story of the season and is, okay I guess. I don't mind it, but I can't say I'm a massive fan either. Average, I suppose. The season ends with the Bad Wolf two-parter, which sees the Daleks return en masse and Christopher Eccleston, presumably having seen some of Season 2's scripts, making the understandable decision to get the fuck out of there while the going was still even halfway good. For the most part, this is actually a pretty excellent story. The first episode is a hoot, combining black comedy with menace in a most entertaining fashion, and Eccleston is absolutely magnificent here. His hilarious disinterest in being on Big Brother, followed by his utter disgust when he realizes the true nature of the show, his shock at Rose's apparent death, and then the sheer badassness of his escape from custody. I love the bit where he just casually slams the guard into the wall and carries on walking without even sparing a single glance back. Eccles is on barnstorming form here. Part 2 becomes an all-action story and is again very entertaining, with some seriously cool moments like the silent extermination from space. I say, for the most part, because it does kind of fall apart a little at the end. Rose becoming a demigod to save the day is a bit lame anyway, but the way it renders the Ninth Doctor as ultimately ineffective, impotent and useless in his own fucking regeneration story is absolutely bloody unforgivable. At the time I really enjoyed Series 1 aside from a new niggles, and still think it's one of the better efforts made by the televised fan fiction series. That it led to some of the worst Doctor Who stories and some of the worst television I've ever had the misfortune to experience is not actually this season's fault. I'll get to that with my Series 2 review, which I advise all Tennant and Rose fans to avoid like the proverbial fucking plague. New Who Series 1 gets a B- from me.